The gravel lot outside Pruitt's Diner in Colby Ridge, Tennessee, smelled like rain that hadn't fallen yet, that heavy, electric smell of a summer storm gathering its breath. It was 6:47 in the evening, the sun low and orange behind the ridge line, throwing long shadows across the cracked asphalt, where a single police cruiser sat parked at an angle, blocking in a dusty gray Honda Accord with Ohio plates. Ruth Calloway stood with her back straight and her hands loose at her sides, palms open, the way she had stood 1,000 times before in rooms far more dangerous than this one. She was 58 years old, silver-haired, wearing a plain navy cardigan over a white blouse, reading glasses pushed up into her hair. To anyone driving past, she looked like exactly what she appeared to be, an older woman who'd stopped for coffee on a long drive. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to turn around and place your hands behind your back." The voice belonged to Officer Dale Huckabee, 34 years old, thick through the neck and shoulders, sunglasses on despite the fading light, thumbs hooked into his duty belt in a posture he'd practiced in mirrors more than he'd ever admit. He'd pulled Ruth over for matching the description of a shoplifting suspect from a gas station 40 miles away. A description that, as it happened, fit approximately none of the details of the actual suspect, who was 26 and had been arrested an hour earlier in the next county. Ruth did not turn around immediately. She looked at him instead, steady, unblinking, the way she used to look at 19-year-old privates who thought fear was the same thing as respect. "Officer, I'd like to know why I'm being detained, and I'd like you to state it for your body camera." Something flickered behind Huckabee's sunglasses. His right hand drifted, almost lazily, to the small black device clipped to his chest. There was a soft click. A tiny red light, the kind most people never noticed, but Ruth noticed everything blinked once and went dark. He turned it off. "Camera's not your business, ma'am. Hands behind your back, now." Ruth exhaled slowly through her nose, a long, controlled breath, 4 counts in, hold, 6 counts out. A rhythm burned into her nervous system decades ago by a man who used to say, "The body panics before the mind does. Don't let it vote first." She thought of her father in that instant the way she always did when the air around her turned sharp. She thought of his voice, low and even, telling her, "Stand tall, stay calm, let them underestimate you, let the truth do the rest." She turned around. She placed her hands behind her back. The cuffs were cold and they closed too tight, deliberately, she suspected, a small cruelty meted out because she hadn't flinched, hadn't begged, hadn't given him the fear he was fishing for. Metal bit into the thin skin of her wrists. Somewhere behind her, a phone camera rose into the golden light held by a teenage boy named Marcus, who had been sweeping the diner's front steps, and would post the video shaking breathless 40 minutes later. With the caption, "This lady did nothing and this cop just slammed her against the car," because that's what came next, a hand at the back of her neck, a push. Her cheek meeting sun-warm metal, the hood of the cruiser radiating the day's heat into her skin, gravel dust in her nostrils, her glasses knocked askew. And still, Ruth Calloway did not raise her voice. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly, almost gently, the words meant for him alone. "Not the mistake you think." To understand what happened next, what would within 72 hours bring federal investigators a formal Department of Justice inquiry, 3 network news trucks, and the quiet unraveling of an entire town's carefully buried history, you have to understand who Ruth Calloway was before she ever pulled off the interstate looking for a cup of coffee and a quiet place to grieve. Ruth was born in 1968 in a small logging town in Oregon, the only child of Colonel Everett Calloway, a career Army officer who had served 2 tours and eventually taught leadership and ethics at West Point for the final decade of his career. Everett Calloway was not a loud man. He did not believe in raised voices or slammed doors or displays of temper as displays of strength. What he believed in What he drilled into his daughter across a childhood of long walks and longer silences was that composure was not the absence of feeling. It was the mastery of it. Anger is a match, he used to tell her, sitting on the porch of their quarters at West Point while she did her homework by lamplight. It only burns because you let it have air. Take the air away and it dies on its own. But the man who can't control his own fire will always try to burn something else to feel powerful. Ruth had absorbed this philosophy the way other children absorbed nursery rhymes, so early, so thoroughly, that it stopped feeling like a lesson and simply became who she was. She went on to attend law school at Georgetown, then spent 6 years as an Army JAG Advocate General officer, serving in Germany and later at the Pentagon, before transitioning to a long, quiet, extraordinarily distinguished career as a Federal Appellate Judge, one of the first women appointed to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, though her name rarely appeared in headlines because Ruth Calloway had never once sought them. She wrote careful opinions. She mentored young clerks. She retired 18 months ago. At 57, not because she had to, but because her husband Daniel had died of pancreatic cancer 11 months prior, and for the first time in her adult life, Ruth found she had no appetite for the bench, the robes, the endless procedural weight of other people's disputes. She wanted quiet. She wanted roads, which was why on this particular Tuesday in July she was driving from her home outside Columbus, Ohio, to Colby Ridge, Tennessee, a town she had never visited where her father, Colonel Everett Calloway, had been born in 1941 and had left at 18 to enlist, never returning except for his own mother's funeral in 1979. Ruth was making the trip because, going through her father's effects after his death 3 years earlier, she'd found a small tin box of letters, correspondence between her father and a woman named Alma Whitfield, a girl he'd loved before the Army, before the world got so large. Ruth wanted to see the town. She wanted to stand where her father had stood before he became the man who raised her. She wanted, quietly and without ceremony, to lay a small bundle of wildflowers on a grave in the Colby Ridge Cemetery, her grandmother's grave, unvisited by family for 45 years. She had stopped at Prute's Diner for coffee, tired from the drive, planning to eat a slow dinner and find a motel before continuing to the cemetery in the morning. She had not planned on Dale Huckabee. Officer Huckabee had been with the Colby Ridge Police Department for 9 years. He was, by every metric that mattered to the people who ran the department, a good cop, meaning he made his numbers, wrote his tickets, and never generated enough paperwork to require anyone above him to actually look closely at what that paperwork contained. What the numbers didn't show was the low, simmering resentment that had calcified inside him over 9 years of feeling, correctly, in his estimation, that Colby Ridge was beneath him. He'd wanted state police. He'd failed the psychological evaluation twice, for reasons the department had quietly never disclosed to him, and had settled bitterly into small-town patrol, where the only power available to him was the power to make ordinary people flinch. He had noticed Ruth's car in the lot because it had out-of-state plates and because, in Dale Huckabee's private taxonomy of the world, out-of-state meant doesn't know the rules here, doesn't have anyone who'll vouch for them, won't fight back. The description he radioed in, older white female, silver hair, blue cardigan, was invented almost entirely from what he could see through the diner's front window, embroidered just enough to sound official. When he approached her at the counter, coffee in hand, Ruth had looked up and offered the kind of pleasant, neutral smile people give strangers in small towns. He'd asked for her ID. She'd provided it, an Ohio driver's license unremarkable along with unprompted. A federal courthouse ID badge that had slipped out of her wallet, along with it, which she did not draw attention to, and which he did not bother to read closely. Because reading closely was not something Dale Huckabee did when he had already decided what kind of person he was looking at. "Ma'am, I'm gonna need you to step outside with me. May I ask what this is regarding, officer? Step outside, please. She had stepped outside. She had answered every question calmly, precisely, the way she'd cross-examined careless prosecutors for 20 years, which, if anything, made Huckabee angrier, because her calm read to him not as cooperation but as defiance, an insult wrapped in politeness. When she asked, a second time gently, for the stated legal basis of the stop, his jaw had tightened and his thumb had found the Bodycam clip. The click, the dying light. Every officer on the Colby Ridge Force knew the department's bodycams could be disabled with a long press of the side button, ostensibly for restroom breaks and sensitive victim interviews. Every officer also knew, quietly, unofficially, in the way institutional rot always travels through knowing glances rather than memos, that Dale Huckabee used that button more than anyone else on the force, and that nobody had ever asked him why. What followed took 90 seconds. 90 seconds that would end a career, crack open a decade of buried complaints, and put Colby Ridge, Tennessee, population 4,200, onto the front page of 3 national newspapers by Friday morning. Huckabee spun her toward the cruiser. His hand found the back of her neck, not violently, not by the textbook definition, but with a controlling firmness meant to communicate something Ruth understood intimately. I can do this to you, and nothing will happen to me. Her cheek met the hood. The metal was warm from the day's heat, and she felt it against her skin with a strange clinical detachment, some old training surfacing on its own. Note the details, you will need them later. The smell of hot metal, the pressure point at your collarbone. The second officer arriving 30 feet still in his vehicle. Marcus 17 phone raised captured the moment the cuffs closed. The audible ratchet of metal, Ruth's face pressed sideways, calm eyes open, and Huckabee's voice raised now, performing anger for an audience he didn't realize was filming. You people think you can just come in here and mouth off, you people. 2 words that would be replayed for 3 million times by Thursday night. By 7:15 p.m. Marcus's video was posted to a local Facebook group, Colby Ridge Community Voices, captioned simply, "This just happened at Pruitt's. This lady wasn't doing anything." By 9:00 p.m. it had 40,000 views. By midnight, a true crime commentary account with 2 million followers had reposted it with the caption, "Small town cop loses IT on elderly woman. Where is his BODYCAM footage?" By 6:00 a.m. the next morning, it was on the local news affiliate's morning show, and by noon, a national outlet had picked it up. Inside the Colby Ridge police station, the reaction was a slow-building, low-grade panic, the kind that moves through hallways and whispers before anyone dares say it in a meeting. Officer Priya Desmukh, 26, 2 years on the force, had watched the video on her phone in the break room, hand over her mouth, and felt something she'd been suppressing for 18 months finally crystallize into certainty. I have to say something. I should have said something a long time ago. Priya was the junior officer who processed Ruth's intake at the station that evening. Fingerprints, booking photo, the cold fluorescent hum of the holding area, the particular institutional smell of stale coffee and industrial disinfectant that every police station in America seems to share. It was Priya who, filling out the booking form, asked Ruth for her occupation, and it was Priya who watched Ruth's face, calm, patient, faintly amused, as she answered. "Retired," Ruth said. "Federal Judge, United States Court of Appeals for the 6th Circuit." Priya's pen stopped moving. "I'm sorry you said judge." "I did. Ma'am, I need to. Can you wait here one moment?" Priya walked, not ran, though every instinct told her to run, back to the small, windowless office where Sergeant Bill Tanner was finishing his end-of-shift paperwork. She closed the door behind her. "Sarge, the woman Huckabee brought in, she says she's a federal appellate judge." Tanner didn't look up at first. Everybody's somebody when they're in cuffs, Desmuck. I looked her up on my phone. Priya said it on the desk, the search results glowing. Ruth Calloway, 6th Circuit, confirmed by 3 judicial directories, retired 18 months ago. Sarge, her husband, Daniel Calloway, was a federal prosecutor. Her father was an Army colonel who taught at West Point. Tanner finally looked up and Priya watched something drain out of his face in real time. The particular color a man's skin turns when he understands, all at once, that the ground he's been standing on was never as solid as he assumed. Where's Huckabee? Booking her paperwork. He wants to charge her with resisting and disorderly conduct. Get him, now, and do not let him finish those charges. In the holding area, Ruth sat with her hands folded in her lap, her wrists faintly bruised, waiting with the particular stillness of someone who had spent 30 years watching the machinery of justice grind slowly and knew, with absolute certainty, that the machine always eventually turned. She was not afraid. She had, if anything, the calm of a woman watching a chess board on which she'd already seen the mate in 4. She thought of her father again, of a specific afternoon she must have been 11, when a boy at school had shoved her down in the schoolyard for beating him in a spelling contest, and she'd come home, furious, wanting her father to march to the principal's office and demand punishment. Instead, he'd knelt down to her level and said, "Ruth, you don't need to make noise to be strong. Noise is what people use when they don't trust the truth to do the work for them. You tell the truth calmly, completely, one time, and then you let it move through the world at its own speed. It always arrives." When Sergeant Tanner appeared at the holding cell, his posture had changed entirely, the swagger drained out of it, replaced by something closer to a man approaching a superior officer. "Judge Calloway, I want to apologize for this. There's clearly been an error." "There's been more than an error, Sergeant." Ruth's voice remained level, quiet, almost kind, which somehow made it land harder than any shout could have. "Officer Huckabee disabled his body camera before placing his hands on me. I'd like to know if that's a habit of his or an exception made for me tonight." Tanner's silence answered the question more completely than words could have. "I'd also like," Ruth continued, "to speak with whoever handles internal affairs complaints for this department. And I'd like to know how many other complaints have been filed against Officer Huckabee in the past, let's say 5 years, and how many of them were investigated." It was a question Tanner could not answer because the honest answer was 17 complaints, filed by 14 different residents of Colby Ridge and the surrounding county over 6 years, and every single one of them had been quietly closed, unfounded, insufficient evidence camera malfunction within days of filing, a pattern that existed in the department's own records, plainly visible to anyone who bothered to look, which nobody, until this exact moment, ever had. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation opened a preliminary inquiry Thursday morning, less than 18 hours after the video crossed 2 million views. By Friday, the FBI's Civil Rights Division had been contacted, not because a viral video demanded it, though it didn't hurt, but because a retired federal appellate judge had, with characteristic precision, submitted a formal, 5-page written complaint to the U.S. Attorney's Office, citing statute, citing precedent, requesting a pattern and practice investigation into the Colby Ridge Police Department's use of Bodycam privacy mode and its internal affairs review process. Special Agent Denise Acaffer, 22 years with the Bureau, arrived in Colby Ridge on a gray Saturday morning with a single request to the town's interim chief: pull every complaint file involving Officer Dale Huckabee, going back to his date of hire. What she found, over the following 4 days, sitting in a cramped records room that smelled of old paper and mildewed drywall, was not 1 story but 7. There was Harold Jennings, 69, a retired postal worker, stopped in 2019 for erratic driving, that turned out to be nothing more than his hazard lights blinking while he searched for a house number. Cuffed, held for 6 hours, released without charge. His complaint marked unsubstantiated 9 days later. There was Yolanda Marsh, 31, a nurse driving home from a night shift in 2021, pulled over for expired tags that were in fact current. Huckabee's camera malfunctioning for the 11 minutes of the stop, during which Yolanda would later testify he called her the kind of woman who thinks the rules don't apply to her, before releasing her with a warning that left her shaking in her car for 20 minutes afterward, afraid to drive. There was Devin Price, 19. A black college student home for the summer, stopped 3 times in 14 months for matching a description. Each stop ending without charges. Each complaint filed by his mother closed within a week, the family eventually giving up on filing at all because, as Devin's mother told Agent Huckabee through tears in her kitchen, "We learned a long time ago that nobody in that building was going to read what we wrote." And there was Earl Whitfield, 74, a name that struck Ruth with a strange, quiet resonance when she learned of it days later, because Earl was Alma Whitfield's nephew, the same Alma whose letters to Ruth's father had brought her to Colby Ridge in the first place. Earl had been stopped in 2020 walking home from his own porch, mistaken, Huckabee claimed, for a burglary suspect, and had spent a night in a holding cell at 72 years old before anyone bothered to verify his address, which was in fact the house he'd lived in for 40 years, 400 feet from where he'd been detained. Each victim, interviewed separately by Agent Huckabee over the course of that week, told some version of the same story. The calm request to know why met with escalating hostility, the small, deliberate cruelties. The sense afterward of having screamed into a void that had already decided long before they opened their mouths that their voice didn't matter. Each of them had, in their own private way, absorbed the same bitter lesson Devin's mother had spoken aloud, until Ruth Calloway's 90 seconds on a gravel lot cracked the void wide enough for all of them to finally be heard at once. Huckabee, brought in for formal interrogation on Monday, denied everything at first. The same performance of righteous outrage he'd once used on Ruth now aimed at Agent Huckabee, who simply let him talk, let the anger burn itself out on tape, the way Ruth's father might have predicted it would, given nothing to feed on but its own noise. When Huckabee placed the 7 files on the table, one at a time, his outrage curdled slowly into something smaller and more honest. A man watching, in real time, 9 years of quiet, unaccountable power collapse under the simple weight of documentation nobody had ever bothered to read. Chief Roy Draper, who had signed off on the unsubstantiated closure of all 17 complaints without, by his own later admission, reading more than the summary line of any of them, resigned 2 weeks later under a cloud that would eventually include his own separate misconduct findings. A pattern investigators would determine of using internal affairs as a rubber stamp, rather than a review protecting officers who made their ticket quotas over residents who made complaints. The formal hearing took place 11 weeks later in the county courthouse, a modest brick building with a bronze plaque out front commemorating its construction in 1911. Ruth Calloway did not testify with anger. She testified, as she had conducted herself her entire adult life, with the calm, exact, devastating clarity of someone who had spent 30 years teaching others what justice was supposed to sound like. "I am not here," she told the review board, "because of what happened to me. What happened to me lasted 90 seconds and left a bruise that faded within a week. I am here because of what happened to Harold Jennings and Yolanda Marsh and Devin Price and Earl Whitfield, and the 10 others who never came forward at all over 6 years. In a town of 4,200 people, where the machinery meant to protect them, instead, protected the one man doing them harm. My father used to tell me that the law only means something if it means the same thing for the person with the least power in the room as it does for the person with the most. For 6 years, in this town, it did not. Dale Huckabee was terminated from the Colby Ridge Police Department and indicted on charges including deprivation of rights under color of law and official misconduct. He would ultimately plead to a reduced charge, losing his certification permanently and receiving a sentence of 18 months, of which he would serve 14. Chief Draper faced his own separate misconduct proceeding and lost his pension eligibility. The Colby Ridge Police Department entered into a formal consent decree, with the Department of Justice mandating that all Bodycam footage be automatically uploaded and reviewed by an independent civilian oversight board. That any camera malfunction trigger an automatic internal affairs flag rather than a routine dismissal, and that every closed complaint from the previous 8 years be reopened and reviewed by outside counsel. Priya Desmukh, the young officer who had refused to look away, was promoted to sergeant 6 months later, not because Ruth Calloway asked for it, though she quietly wrote a letter of recommendation, but because the department's new civilian oversight board specifically cited her willingness to escalate a superior officer's misconduct as exactly the kind of institutional courage the reforms were designed to protect and reward. Ruth returned to Colby Ridge one final time in October, when the ridge line had gone gold and rust with the turning leaves, and drove the same road she'd meant to drive 4 months earlier, out past the diner now under new ownership past the courthouse, where the hearing had concluded, to the small, quiet cemetery on the hill above town. She found her grandmother's grave easily enough, the stone worn but legible, and knelt to lay the same bundle of wildflowers she'd carried in her car since July, black-eyed Susans and Queen Anne's lace, the kind that grew wild along every roadside in this part of Tennessee. Nearby, she found another stone she hadn't expected to look for, Alma Whitfield's 1943 to 2011, and beside it she now knew the family plot that included Earl, who had visited her once in the weeks after the hearing, an old man's handshake, tears in his eyes, thanking her for something she hadn't done for him at all. She had simply refused to stay quiet about what had been done to her, and the truth, moving at its own unhurried speed, had eventually reached him too. She stayed a long while at the grave, the autumn light falling gold and slanted through the trees, and she thought, as she often did in quiet moments, of her father's voice. Stand tall, stay calm, let them underestimate you, let the truth do the rest. It had cost her nothing to stay calm on that gravel lot in July. Nothing, that is, except the temporary indignity of cuffs, and a bruised wrist a small price, she reflected, for a lesson that 7 other families in this town had paid for in isolation unheard. For years, her calm hadn't been passivity. It had been patience with teeth, the quiet, immovable confidence of someone who understood that the truth, given time and space and enough people finally willing to speak it, always, eventually, arrived. She rose, brushed the grass from her knees, and walked back down the hill toward her car, the ridge line gold behind her, the town below settling into its long, slow work of becoming something better than it had been. Dignity was never supposed to be a privilege reserved for the powerful. It was supposed to be the floor everyone stood on, the badge holder and the retiree, the young black student and the elderly postal worker, the sitting judge and the woman driving home from a night shift with nothing more urgent on her mind than sleep. Ruth Calloway's calm didn't fix Colby Ridge by itself. What fixed it was 7 people, and then 14, and then a town, finally refusing to look away from what had always been visible, if anyone had cared enough to look. If this story moved you, remember the names: Harold, Yolanda, Devin, Earl, and all the others who never got their moment on camera but whose truth mattered exactly as much. Stay calm, stand tall, and when the truth finally arrives, make sure you're the one who helped it get there.